Her home, once full of voices and warmth, now felt hollow. The walls were lined with photographs, but the faces in them were frozen in time, distant and silent. Each step she took echoed too loudly across the wooden floors, reminding her of the absence that filled every corner. The living room, once lively with conversation, now held only stillness. She moved from room to room, touching the furniture gently as if trying to coax memories back to life. Yet the house remained empty. No footsteps followed hers, no laughter answered hers. It was a quiet that seemed endless, and she wondered if the world had forgotten she even lived. Across the table, the chair remained empty. Once, it had been filled with conversation, warmth, and presence. Now, it was a reminder, stark and undeniable, that the people she loved most were gone or distant. She sometimes set a cup of tea on the table, half expecting someone to join her, but the cup remained untouched. The chair was more than furniture. It was a symbol of her isolation. And as she gazed at it, a heavy sigh left her lips, for the companionship she longed for seemed forever out of reach. Yet in the quiet, unseen, he was already near, sitting where the chair had once held someone else. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, all followed the same quiet pattern. She prepared her food carefully, set the table neatly, and ate slowly, listening to the silence. Sometimes she spoke to no one at all, her words dissolving into the still air. The clink of her spoon against the plate felt louder than any conversation once had. Even the flavors seemed muted, deprived of shared joy. She had grown used to it, yet the ache remained, the deep knowing that no human hand would reach across the table today, or tomorrow, or the next day. The phone on the side table sat quietly, its receiver untouched for days. When it rang, it was usually someone she barely knew. She answered politely, offering words she did not really feel. Letters arrived sporadically, some unsigned, some filled with distant affection. She read them slowly, then placed them carefully back on the table. The world outside her home moved on, and she felt invisible, forgotten, alone. Yet, in the quiet, something lingered. A presence unseen, one that would not leave her side, even when the human world turned away. She often rubbed her arms, longing for the warmth of someone beside her. Even the simplest touch, a hand on her shoulder, a hug, a brush of fingers, felt like a distant memory. Her own hands felt cold, even when she tried to warm them in the sun. She missed the comfort of presence, the reassurance that comes from a human connection. Some days, she would wrap herself in a shawl and press her hands to her chest, as if to catch the love she felt was lost. And yet, unseen, he was already there, the one whose touch does not tire, whose embrace never falters. The evenings were long, unbroken, and the house grew colder with the falling dark. She would sit in her chair, staring at the shadows stretching across the floor. No footsteps approached, no voices called her name. Even the familiar sounds of the night, wind, rain, distant dogs, only seemed to deepen the silence. She longed for someone to share the night, even with simple words, even with a sigh or a whisper. And in that emptiness, a soft presence rested nearby, quietly keeping watch over her. She sometimes wondered if anyone, even the one who watches over all, remembered her at all. Years of solitude had built walls around her soul. She whispered prayers, but they felt small, like drifting feathers. "Have you forgotten me?" she would ask quietly, her voice almost lost in the vast silence of the night. Doubt crept in, and the fear of being entirely forgotten weighed heavy on her chest. Yet behind that fear, a gentle truth waited. She was not forgotten. She would soon know it in the quietest, most intimate way. One evening, she exhaled a long, trembling sigh. It carried decades of loneliness, all the unspoken grief, all the yearning for company, love, and warmth. No one heard it but him. No one saw the way her shoulders slumped or the way her hands trembled in silent despair. It was a prayer without words, a cry from a heart that had been too silent for too long. And in the stillness of that breath, a presence moved closer, attentive, patient, unyielding. He was there, waiting, ready to stay. One evening she exhaled a long, trembling sigh. It carried decades of loneliness, all the unspoken grief, all the yearning for company, love and warmth. No one heard it but him. No one saw the way her shoulders slumped, or the way her hands trembled in silent despair. It was a prayer without words, a cry from a heart that had been too silent for too long, and in the stillness of that breath, a presence moved closer, attentive, patient, unyielding. He was there, waiting, ready to stay. The air around her shifted, so softly she almost didn't notice. But something felt different. Her chair, once so solitary, now felt warm. The space beside her, once empty, seemed to hold a quiet weight. She didn't see him, not with her eyes, but she knew he was there. It wasn't an overwhelming presence, not a voice that thundered, but a calm, constant nearness, like the sunlight she couldn't touch, yet could feel on her skin. In the silence, he waited, his nearness a quiet comfort, letting her know she was never as alone as she thought. She heard it in the quiet, a voice that didn't echo, but resonated deep inside. "You are not forgotten." It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The words weren't just spoken, they were felt. Her heart skipped a beat and she looked around expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. Still she knew she wasn't alone. The voice had not come from the world around her, but from the very depth of her soul, where Jesus had quietly stayed, waiting for her to hear. Tears came, unbidden and soft, filling her eyes before she could stop them. They were not tears of sorrow, but of recognition. She had thought she was forgotten. She had believed that her life, her presence, had no impact, no meaning. But as the tears fell, she understood. She had never been forgotten. She had always been seen, loved, and cherished. In the midst of her silence, Jesus had stayed. And now her heart finally knew the truth. She was never alone. Tears came, unbidden and soft, filling her eyes before she could stop them. They were not tears of sorrow, but of recognition. She had thought she was forgotten. She had believed that her life, her presence, had no impact, no meaning. But as the tears fell, she understood she had never been forgotten. She had always been seen, loved, and cherished. In the midst of her silence, Jesus had stayed, and now her heart finally knew the truth. She was never alone. She no longer needed to force words. Even in silence, the conversation flowed. Thoughts and feelings moved between them, like ripples on still water. Her heart spoke what her lips could not, and he responded, gently, fully, completely. No sound was required, no letters or calls or gestures. Every sigh, every heartbeat, every glance at the sunlight became a language of communion. The world remained quiet, but she was never lonely again. She was heard, she was known, she was loved. Her soul began to sing softly, and in that quiet song she discovered the deepest kind of companionship. Even waking became different. The first light of morning no longer seemed empty or harsh. Her heart stirred with a gentle awareness. He was near, still with her, even before her eyes opened fully. She breathed in the new day, feeling it fill her chest, soft, warm, alive. The house, once oppressive in its quiet, now seemed welcoming. Every creak of the floorboards was a reminder of the life that pulsed quietly around her. For the first time in years, morning brought anticipation, not emptiness. Even in the silence, she felt company in every breath she drew. The days followed familiar patterns, sweeping, cooking, folding laundry, but they were no longer empty or mechanical. Each gesture, each movement was imbued with the knowledge that he was near. She smiled as she prepared tea, talked softly to him while dusting the shelves, and even washing dishes became a sacred act. The routine that had once felt monotonous now carried purpose, a rhythm of love and presence that transformed every small task. Her home, her life, her quiet world was no longer lonely. It was a space where communion with him was possible in every breath, every motion, every silent thought. The days followed familiar patterns, sweeping, cooking, folding laundry, but they were no longer empty or mechanical. Each gesture, each movement, was imbued with the knowledge that he was near. She smiled as she prepared tea, talked softly to him while dusting the shelves, and even washing dishes became a sacred act. The routine that had once felt monotonous now carried purpose, a rhythm of love and presence that transformed every small task. Her home, her life, her quiet world was no longer lonely. It was a space where communion with him was possible in every breath, every motion, every silent thought. Her heart began to expand, making room for life once more. She reached out to friends with letters and calls, smiled at neighbors, and even found delight in small interactions she had avoided. Her spirit, long dormant, responded to the love that had been near all along. She laughed softly, dreamed quietly, and embraced the rhythm of each day with a gentle eagerness. The loneliness that had gripped her for so long began to dissolve, replaced by trust and openness. Her soul, once closed, now welcomed life again. Evenings no longer carried the weight of despair. She sat quietly by the window, her hands folded over her chest, and felt a calm that filled every corner of her being. No fear, no trembling, no doubt, only the steady assurance of his presence. The home, once silent and oppressive, was now a sanctuary. She rested fully, knowing he would never leave, that his love would remain faithful, constant, eternal. And in that quiet, she finally breathed freely. When her life on earth drew to a close, she felt no fear. She stepped into eternity, and the one who had stayed with her all along welcomed her with open arms. Every tear, every sigh, every moment of silence was transformed into a sacred memory of his faithfulness. Loneliness was no more. Love, presence, and peace flowed endlessly. Even in eternity, her story whispers, when the world abandons, he stays, and in his staying, the soul is never alone again.